This is a shir on the Sichos Chelek Tes Zayin, Parshas Boy, the second Sicha. In this week's Parsha, in the instruction for Korban Pesach, which Hashem told Moshe Rabbeinu, so the Pasuk says, on the 10th of this month, each man should take a lamb to the house of his father. In other words, per family, Selah, boys, one lamb per house. And in the future psukim it says, in the ongoing psukim it says, and this should be for you as a remembering mishmeres. In other words, you should guard this. You should have this lamb till the 14th day of this month. So in the when the Bnei Yisrael in the desert, if we're in Mitzrayim, that 1 year they had to take the Korban Pesach on the 10th of the month, and they kept it tied to the bedpost till the 14th day of the month, and then v'shachatu say the kol kala dasel ben arbaim, all the Jewish community will shecht it in the afternoon, 14th of Nisan in the afternoon, and then continues the pasuk v'achlis abasa v'layla zeh, they will eat the meat on this night, sliesh u'matzes, roasted with fire, u'matzes al mereirim yechlu, and together with matzes and morer bitter herbs they will eat it. So the Rambam, so there was two parts to this thing. There was taking the shechting the Korban Pesach and eating the Korban Pesach. The Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvahs counts this as two mitzvahs. One mitzvah is lishchaytza Pesach, to shecht the lamb of the Pesach on the 14th day of Nisan in the afternoon. And this is what the Eibusha says in the pasuk v'shachatu eisei kol kala dasel ben arbaim, that the community of Israel should shecht the Korban Pesach in the afternoon. And the second mitzvah is, that's one mitzvah, to shech the Korban Pesach. The second mitzvah is lechel keves HaPesach, to eat the lamb of the Pesach on the night of the 15th of Nisan, according to the instructions that I mentioned. And this is what it says, v'achol sabasa v'lazeh, they should eat the meat on this night. Okay. So he says it's two mitzvahs. So the question is asked, just a note on who asked this question, just because it was interesting for me, I'm going to share it with you. Look in footnote 5, you see it's Rabbi Daniel Habavli in a book called Ma'aseh Nisim. I looked it up, and it's online in the Chabad, in the Agudas Tzedek Chabad library. Rabbi Daniel Habavli, first of all, this was a book printed, why is it called Ma'aseh Nisim? It was a book printed by a great philanthropist. His name was Nisim, so it was named in his honor. These are questions, apparently, that Rabbi Daniel Habavli asked on the Rambam, and this book is printed together with the responses of the son of the Rambam, Rabbi Avram, the son of the Rambam, Ben Moshe. So it's fascinating. Okay. So the question is asked, the Rambam has himself given a rule that everything that the Chachamim said, that a particular mitzvah has a few details, and each detail is key to the mitzvah. One stops the other. In other words, one is hinged on the other. So it's clear that it's really one mitzvah. And similarly, when it's been explained to you that to get to the required destination, in other words, to fulfill the mitzvah, you can't get there with only doing one component of the mitzvah. So then you understand that the mitzvah is counted as the cluster of mitzvahs that comprise that one mitzvah. In the counting of the 613 mitzvahs, they'll be counted as one mitzvah. Just a note on counting mitzvahs, everybody agrees on the number 613. The question is exactly how to reach that number, which things are counted as separate mitzvahs, which things are counted as a few mitzvahs together. So the Rambam says that things that are part and components of one mitzvah, that one part can't be without the other, they're considered one mitzvah. So the question asked on the Rambam is like this. This is your rule, Rambam, in counting mitzvahs. So since the Korban Pesach, Rambam says that without eating the Pesach, you're not able to fulfill the mitzvah of Korban Pesach. How do we see this? Because there's a halacha that to belong to a Korban Pesach, you have to first of all be registered on that Korban Pesach. So what happens if people came and registered to be part of eating this Korban Pesach? And then other people came. Yeah. Other people came, and there's not enough. Comes the night of Pesach, there's not enough for everybody to eat a kazayis. So the first registered people that eat, and there's a kazayis for them, they eat, and they're potter for making the second Pesach. The latter people, the latter registrations that came, and there's no longer a kezayis. If you would have split up the Korban Pesach, you see there's no longer kezayis for them. So they don't eat. The other people who registered first come first. They don't eat. And what will happen is that when you shechted initially, and you're chayiv to do the second Pesach, well, it turns out that when they were registered on the Pesach, when they shechted the Pesach, the registration has to be done before the Shechita, there wasn't enough for them. They weren't included. So what do we see? I mean, they were included. They were registered. They weren't included because there wasn't anything for them to eat. So you see that eating and shechting is integrally part of the same thing. So it should come out that Shechita and eating the Pesach is one mitzvah. So why does the Rambam count it as two mitzvahs? Moreover, even according to the opinions in the Gemara then Masechta Pesachim, there are opinions in the Gemara that the actual eating of the Korban Pesach doesn't obstruct bringing the Pesach. In other words, even if the people are not going to be able to eat the Pesach at night, but still you if it was shechted properly, you bring it up. But what's the point? Even though it may still be a kosher Korban Pesach, but the teichen, the intent of the mitzvah of bringing the Korban Pesach is still all about eating the Pesach. Because the whole concept, even according to those opinions, is that Pesach leiba mitchilase Allah chila, the Gemara says. The Pesach comes initially only for eating. So there are other korbanos that come for being burnt on the mizbeach. Pesach comes. The purpose is to be eaten, and that's why a Pesach that was offered up was sacrificed in conditions of tumah. If most of the Bnei Yisrael are tumah, then it's offered up in tumah. Then it's eaten also in tumah. Technically, you could say, okay, if the Bnei Yisrael are tumah, so let's shech the Korban Pesach, but why eat it? Let's leave the eating out. No, if it was brought in tumah, the whole point is to be eaten. It was brought in tumah. The Torah waives during those circumstances where most of the Bnei Yisrael are tumah. It says, okay, so the Korban Pesach will be brought nonetheless and be eaten nonetheless in tumah. Why? The reasoning for that is because, as Rashi explains there, because the whole purpose of the Korban Pesach is for eating. So if that's the case, you see how they're totally bound up with each other. Why is the Rambam counted as two mitzvahs? So the Rabbi Avram, the son of the Rambam, answers, again, brought in that Sefer Ma'aseh Nisim, that they're dividing it into two mitzvahs is because the fact that the Shechita is dependent, the Shechita is at one time, it's the 14th day of Nisan, but the eating of the Korban Pesach is in another time. It's on the 15th, night of the 15th. And then there's another thing that draws the two mitzvahs of Shechita and eating apart. The shecht in the Korban Pesach, if a person didn't participate in being registered on a Korban Pesach that was shechted, then there's kodis, the heavenly punishment of being cut off. However, neglecting to eat the Korban Pesach is a violation of just like any other mitzvah, as any other positive mitzvah that wasn't fulfilled. And it doesn't have a connection with the punishment of kodis. If a person did offer up the Korban Pesach and he just didn't get to eat it on the night of the 15th, so he did the mitzvah of shechting the Korban Pesach, but he's potter from Kodesh, and he doesn't have to bring a Pesach Sheni as well. So what do you see from here? You see that they're two separate things. You're going to ask me, says the Rebbe in the footnote, 1 second. We just said that if people registered on the Korban Pesach, they were part of the Korban Pesach at the Shechita, but there wasn't enough for them to eat, they have to bring a Korban Pesach Sheni. The answer to that is that you know already when they're shechting, you already see that there's not enough for them. Technically, you look back and see you were registered, but the registration was full. Your registration wasn't accepted. So you weren't part of the shechita either. Anyway, so that's the answer. It's two separate things, the shechita and the eating, although one is intended for the other, but you see there are two separate times and there's even two separate levels of severity if it was omitted. Base. However, it's not so simple because according to the Rabbi Avram, the son of the Rambam, he explained that the eating of the Korban Pesach in actuality doesn't block the fulfillment of the mitzvah of the shechita. Could have done the shechita and no kares, then you just didn't eat it. You can't bring a Korban Pesach sheni. You were part of the Pesach in some way. However, let's still look at it from the fact that since the purpose of the shechita is eating, and that's why it has to be able to be eaten at the time when you shecht it, like we said, there's got to be enough room in registration, for example. So still there should have been one mitzvah. As the Rambam himself writes when explaining the Sharshei mitzvahs, the sources or the roots of the mitzvahs, that even when the details are not even going to hold each other back, are not ma'akiv. Ma'akiv means they're not whatever. They're not going to. They're going to hold it. There's a word. Sorry, I don't have it with me now. They're not going to be holding each other back, but still in all, if the concept is one, they join and form into being one mitzvah. So this thing that the shechita and the eating are in two separate mitzvahs, because each one is at its own time, we need to explain what does that mean. How is that? Because we find several mitzvahs that the mitzvahs have different times of being mechuyev. However, they're not even blocking one the other. They're not hinged on each other. Nonetheless, the Rambam counts them as one mitzvah. The Rabbi says in footnote 18, for example, reading the Kriya Shema is one mitzvah, but there's a reading Kriya Shema in the morning and in the evening, two different times. Bringing the daily sacrifice is a mitzvah, but there's a boiker, there's a carbon tamid in the morning and one in the afternoon. They're not two mitzvahs, they're one mitzvah. And one doesn't withhold the other. If you read the Shema in the morning and you didn't read it in the night, your Shema in the morning is still kosher. One is not hinged on the other yet, and they're not at the same times. Yet they're one mitzvah because the concept is the same. To remember the yichud of Hashem, to proclaim the unity of Hashem, and it divides into two times, morning and evening. So here too, it's a shechita and eating of Korban Pesach. It's two different times. It's two different things, but it's one content. Why does the Rambam split them into two mitzvahs? Gimel. So we'll understand this by first asking another question, a more general question. By Korban Chatas, the pasuk says the Chatas should be shechted, and the kohen who has done the service of bringing the Chatas, he should eat the parts that the kohen eats. Nonetheless, the Rambam does not count the eating of the Chatas as a separate mitzvah saseh. He joins it, he includes it within the mitzvah of eating all kinds of kodshim, all kinds of karbonis. His language is that the mitzvah is that the kohanim were instructed to eat the flesh of the kodshim, of the karbonis. In other words, kalaymar, the chatos and the asham sacrifice, which are kodshim, holy of holies, and then there's other kodshim kalim, other forms of karbonis, which are the more lighter forms of kedusha. And the eating is part of the mitzvah. In other words, there's a mitzvah of eating kodshim. There's a chatas, there's a asham. It's all part of that same father mitzvah, general mitzvah. That's one mitzvah of the kohanim eating kodshim, eating karbonos. So why does the Rambam write that eating the Korban Pesach is a separate mitzvah? Why doesn't he just say it? The mitzvah of eating kodshim. Pesach is also a kodshim kalim. The takanat kohanim. The Rebbe has a big discussion here about it in the footnote, but it still is part of the mitzvah of eating kodshim. So the explanation here is this, that the Rambam himself explains in his exact lashon. What does he say about the mitzvah of Korban Pesach? He says like this: Shetzivonu lechel b'sar Pesach. We were instructed to eat the flesh of the Pesach. Beleil chamisha asar b'Nisan b'Tanav aniskarim, on the eve of the 15th of Nisan, with all of its requisite details, which are, as he continues, should be roasted, should be eaten in one house, should be eaten with matzah and mortar. And this is what it says: you should eat the flesh on this night, roasted on fire, and matzahs and mortar, you should eat it. In other words, till this was the lashon of the Rambam. In other words, when the Torah gives all these details and all these boundaries on how the mitzvah of Korban Pesach should be fulfilled, not like Korban Chatas, which just says the kohen that brought it should eat it. Similarly, other karbonos, the details of how the requisite eating should take place isn't given. So the Torah has distinguished this chiyuv of eating the Korban Pesach as a separate mitzvah, with a whole host of details. And so it is also with the shechita of the Korban Pesach, that there's other details has to be done in a particular way. It's been on the 14th of Nisan, after Chatzos, in its proper time. So in other words, it's not just part of the regular, generic, so to speak, cover all of the mitzvah to bring and to eat karbonos. To say it in a little bit of a different style, says Rabbi Sigler Nacher, and according to the way that the son of the Rambam presented it. Since the mitzvah of shechita was said together and given with its particular time, it was the Torah, when it said about shechita and Korban Pesach, clearly defined it based on the fact that it has to be on the 14th of Nisan. And the mitzvah of achila, of eating the Korban Pesach, was hinged and expressed together with its particular time, and together with its nuances and details of how it should be eaten, where and how it should be eaten. So we understand that the difference between the shchita of the Pesach and the eating of the Pesach, it's not just we understand that this difference in time between the shchita of the Korban Pesach and the eating of the Korban Pesach is not just a general, it's not part of the general concept of eating karbanos, which automatically this mitzvah is eating karbanos, right? However, which we find, for example, that, I'm not sure what that means here in the brackets, we find by karbanos that their bringing up has to be dafka by day. No, I'm not sure. There's a long footnote here, so I'm sorry about this. No, I'm not sure exactly what this bracket means. Okay. However, again, the fact that the Torah gave each part of this mitzvah, the shchita and the eating, and hinged each part of this mitzvah in its particular time. This mitzvah, in other words, it's not just these are not details that are applicable to every carbon. This is details that single out Korban Pesach will be shechted on the day of Yudalid. This now I understand what the brackets are saying. Not just like general mitzvahs. In other words, all korbanos have to be brought by day. So why does the Torah have to tell us by Korban Pesach to be brought by day? It's part of korbanos. But you see that the Torah didn't rely on the general rule that korbanos are part of the day. The Torah by Pesach singled out the time. It has to be by the day of the 14th. And the eating has to be in the evening. So you see that this mitzvah has been singled out to be a separate mitzvah. And therefore, what we see is that this individuality of the mitzvah is not just that the Korban Pesach is separate from all korbanos, has separate instructions, but both details of the Korban Pesach are individually wrapped, so to speak. One is 14th day, one is the eve of the 15th, and because of this, you see that the Torah wrapped them individually, so to speak. So the Rambam keeps them as two mitzvahs. Dalit. So also by the obligation of Korban Pesach, of Pesach Sheni, which according to the Rambam, it's its own regel, it's its own Yom Tov, separate from the first Pesach. The Rambam also there, by Pesach Sheni, divides this mitzvah, shchita and eating, to two separate mitzvahs. Now we'll also understand it's the same reason. Same thing we said by Korban Pesach Rishon, that the eating has to be with details of matzahs and matter. And that's the tzivanu, that's the instruction with which the eating of the Pesach Sheni is given. So that's different than the shchita, right? You can't just put it together with the shchita. Yeah, the shchita is in order to eat, but the eating has its own seder aveda, it's its own individually presented mitzvah. However, we don't understand, why does mitzvahs eating the Pesach Sheni, why isn't it included in the same mitzvah of eating the first Pesach? In other words, yeah, it's two times. If you didn't bring the first Pesach on the 14th of Nisan, you bring the second one on the 14th of Iyar, and you eat it on the eve of the 15th of Iyar. Two separate times, but the content is the same. You have an obligation to eat the Korban Pesach on matzahs with matzah and matter in the evening after it was brought up. And automatically, you just have to see when was the shchita. If you did the first Pesach, it was in Nisan. If not, it was in Iyar. That's just a result of whenever the shchita was. But the mitzvah should be the one mitzvah. Eat it in the evening after it was brought. Right? But Mela, so even though, so the explanation of this is, even though we've explained earlier, the shchita, the Korban Pesach, and the eating are each connected with their own individual time. That's what creates the separation that makes the two separate mitzvahs. However, there's a difference in the way of the way that it expresses itself between the first Pesach and second Pesach. The Yom Tov of Yud Daled Nisan, right? That's Erev Pesach, day before Pesach. It's a Yom Tov day. What makes it a Yom Tov? Only because that's the day that the Korban Pesach is brought. That's what makes that day special. On its own, it's just the 14th day of Nisan, the day before Pesach. It's not Pesach yet. However, the eve of the 15th of Nisan, Pesach evening, is a special day also, and actually mainly because it's a Yom Tov. It's a time of going out of Egypt. And as it was in the first time of history, that Hashem said, I passed through Eretz Mitzrayim on this night of Pesach. I smote every firstborn. Fasachti alechem, and I jumped over your doors. That's called Pesach. And it's Leil Shimurim Ul Hashem. It's the night that was guarded and especially watched by Hashem to take them out of Egypt. And the pasuk says Hashem took you out of Egypt at night. It was this night. And because of that, because of the importance of the time, that's why the mitzvah of eating the Korban Pesach is done at that time. And therefore, automatically, in other words, if the Pesach has to be eaten at the evening, so the Korban Pesach is brought the day before on Yud Daled Nisan. But Pesach Sheni, you don't have that dynamic. The eating of Pesach Sheni, the night of the 15th, is not because tonight's the 15th of Iyar. It's a Yom Tov. No, it's not a Yom Tov. The Yom Tov was the 15th of Nisan. But only because on this night, this is the night after you had a chance to do a makeup korban on the 14th of Iyar. So, this is not the same mitzvah of eating the first Korban Pesach. By the first Korban Pesach, the time of eating the Korban Pesach is in itself a detail of the mitzvah. Pesach Sheni, the time of eating the Korban Pesach doesn't have any connection to the actual mitzvah of the eating. Two separate. They have two separate mitzvahs with two separate characters. Hey, so with this we'll understand why the din of Hallel by Pesach Rishon and the difference between saying Hallel by the first Korban Pesach and second Korban Pesach has a difference. What's the difference? Amongst the differences between first Pesach, Pesach Rishon, and Pesach Sheni, the Mishnah says the first Pesach requires Hallel when you eat it. The second one doesn't require Hallel when you eat it. And it says, but both of them require Hallel when you make the Korban Pesach. In other words, when you shecht and offer up the Korban Pesach, they both require Hallel. Now, about this halacha that the first Korban Pesach when you eat it requires Hallel, the Gemara says, how do you know that? Rabbi Yechanan says, and he brings a pasuk from Yeshaya speaking about the Geula, and he says the song you're going to sing by the Geula, Ashir Yelachem, this song that you're going to sing is going to be Kalel Iskadesh Chag, like the song you sing when the holy day comes, which is referring to the Pesach. In other words, what the pasuk is telling you that the night, Laila Mekudesh Lachag, says the Gemara, the night that has been sanctified as being a holiday, we see from this pasuk, it requires Hallel. You're going to sing to Hashem like the night that's a holiday. That means that the night that's a holiday, Pesach, you have to sing Hallel. Then the Gemara says, but both, and it doesn't say this about Pesach Sheni. Pesach Rishon is the night of the holiday. Both of them require, for the actual preparation of the Korban Pesach, require Hallel when you make the Pesach. Why? So, says the Gemara, for two reasons. If you want to say Ibai Sema, on one hand I can say why, because it says Laila, that at the night, when it's a Chag, that's when you sing. So you see the Torah emphasizes night. So we understand that nighttime, that's a Yom Tov, that's when you say Shira. Yom Leikam Emayit. It doesn't say that by day it also has to be you only say the Shira on a day that's a Yom Tov. So therefore you can say it when you bring the Korban Pesach. Or another answer, can it be, this is an interesting logic, can it be that the Yidden are shechting the Pesach or taking their lulavs and not saying Hallel? Of course they would say Hallel. So then it has like this, from the fact that when we said that it needs Hallel when you make it, the Gemara asked with the Lashon, my time, for what reason do you need Hallel? It didn't say, how do we know? When it said about the first Korban Pesach requires Hallel by eating it, it says, how do we know it? And we said, because there's a pasuk in Yeshaya that says, just like the night of the Chag, you sing. We don't understand, the night of Chag, you sing. But here the Gemara just asked, why don't, my time, and not how do we know we don't say, it says, why don't we say Hallel on the second Korban Pesach by eating? And also from the fact that the Gemara answers, in the first answer, the Gemara says that the nighttime was excluded. Day wasn't excluded. So it means that with this discussion of the Gemara is looking to explain not why both require halal for making the Korban Pesach. No, but what's the difference between the shchita of the second Pesach, which requires halal, and the eating of the second Pesach, which doesn't require halal? We know that eating the Korban Pesach, that making the Korban Pesach requires halal. Shechting Korban Pesach and eating the Korban Pesach is a residual effect of that. So on the first carbon, you say halal for eating it. Why don't you do it on? Why is there a distinction? The second Pesach, you say halal by making it, but you don't say halal by eating it. Why not? So we have to understand, first of all, why Taka doesn't the Gemara ask, how do we know about the fact that you need halal when you make the Korban Pesach? Just like it asked, how do you know that you need halal when you eat the first Korban Pesach? Why doesn't it ask about the shechting? Two, since the whole question of the Gemara is about the difference between why by the second Pesach do you make halal only on the doing and not on the eating, so what did the Gemara answer in the second answer? Could it be that Yisrael is shechting and they don't say halal? This doesn't explain any difference between why there should be the difference between the shchita and the eating. You could say the same svara about the eating. Could it be that Yisrael are eating the Korban Pesach, not saying halal, and that would apply also to the second Pesach? So the explanation is like this: from the pasuk, this shir, you will have this song will be like the night of Chag. From this we understand only one thing. No, from this we understand not just that on a night that's a Chag you say halal, which the Gemara says it excludes if it's a night that's not a Chag, you don't say halal. But this actually tells you the whole geder, the whole concept of why there's an obligation of halal when you eat the Korban Pesach. Not because of eating the Korban Pesach. No, because it's the evening of the Chag. It's the evening of where it's our holiday. In other words, this is the time of the Geula, of the redemption and the miracles of Yetzias Mitzrayim, and that's why you have to say halal. In other words, since the eating of the Pesach on the 15th, the eve of the 15th of Nisan, is in actuality connected with the redemption and the miracles of that night, because that's the reason that the Korban Pesach is eaten on that night. So that's why this mitzvah is connected with the saying of halal when you eat the Pesach, because it's a night of Chag, a night of miracle. And this we understand about Pesach Sheni. It doesn't have that. It's not a night that's got this Chag. It wasn't a time of miracles, and therefore it's not a Chag. And therefore, the eating of the Pesach Sheni doesn't require halal, because the eating itself is not enough a reason to say halal. Then Zion, then after this answer of the Gemara, and in connection to this answer where he says the first you need halal on the eating the first one because it's Yom Tov, the second one doesn't have that. Then the Gemara says, so why do you make halal when making the Korban Pesach on both of them? He says, for what reason? If you're not saying halal, what's the time of chilus v'shchit basement halal achilasei on halal favos shchitosei? In other words, it comes out that the eating of the Korban Pesach Sheni is different than the Shechita. The one is not asking why the Shechita requires halal, because that wouldn't be the place to ask it here when we're saying the difference between Pesach Shabbos and Pesach Sheni. That you should ask when the Mishnah first says way back that you need halal by Shechita. You should have asked that question. This Mishnah is just saying the details of the differences and distinctions between the first Pesach and second Pesach. So that's why the Gemara says that the geder, the concept of saying halal when you shecht, it's different than eating than the eating. It's two separate things. In other words, the first teretz, it says that the pasuk says that on the night that's a chag you say halal, you say a song, which excludes a night that's not a Yom Tov, which would be the 15th of a year, right? But the second. But the saying of halal by so we understand why we don't say it on the eve. But the second halal, but the saying of halal by day doesn't have anything to do with the time. That has to do with the actual shechita of the carbon, and therefore that's not excluded. In other words, the first teretz is mainly emphasizing the difference between saying halal by day and saying it by night is that the saying Hallel by night has got to do with the Yom Tov. But that doesn't exclude what to do with saying the Yom Tov. It doesn't say that the Hallel said by day has to do somehow with the specialty of the day. And therefore, the day is not excluded. The day of the 14th of a year is not excluded. The second answer is saying, could Bnei Yisrael be shechting Pesach and not saying Hallel? It expresses why do we say Hallel by day? It's got to do with the shechting. And therefore we understand that you have to say Hallel by the Shechita of the second Pesach, just like you say by the Shechita of the first Pesach. Which is different than the saying Hallel by the eating of the first Pesach. We're not saying Hallel because of the eating of the Pesach. That's not enough reason to say Hallel. It's because it's a night of Yom Tov. And therefore by the eating of the Pesach on the night of the 15th of the year, you don't have that reason. It's not a Yom Tov. And you could say that the difference between these two answers is, according to the first answer, we could say that the saying of Hallel by Shechita has to do with the time with the Yom, with the fact that it's a day, just like eating it. Just like by the eating of the Korban Pesach, with one difference. By the eating of the Korban Pesach, the time itself is a reason. It's a Yom Tov. Whereas by the Shechita Korban Pesach, the Shechita creates the time that is a time of Hallel. Through the mitzvah of Shechita Korban Pesach, the day becomes a day of Hallel. And so the first answer is that the Torah says by night that's a Chag, you say Hallel, and there's no exclusion for day. So a day that's a Chag, and why is it a Chag? Because you brought up the Korban Pesach. So then you say Hallel, and that's also a Chag for the second Pesach. The second one is, the second answer is saying there's nothing to do with the time. It's got to do simply with the act of Shishchet and Korban Pesach. You bring a Korban Pesach without saying Hallel, and that applies also on the second Pesach as well. Akopani, what we got from this whole discussion is, according to both answers, since the reason that Pesach, Rishon, the first Pesach, when you make it, requires Hallel, is not because of the time in and of itself, that the time requires you, this Zman of Yud Daled somehow brings an obligation of Hallel, but it's the Shechita that brings it. So we understand from this that in this sense, both first Pesach and second Pesach are the same. You're offering a Korban Pesach, and therefore it requires Hallel. So to sum it all up, we explain why it's two separate mitzvahs. the bringing the Korban Pesach and the eating the Korban Pesach is two separate mitzvahs because each one has its time, each one has its distinct details. Just like Korban Pesach is not just part of the mitzvah of eating Kodashim, eating Korbanos Bechlal, you see it singled out separately. Similarly, the shechting and the eating have been singled out in their own individual parameters. Why isn't Pesach Sheni, eating Korban Pesach Sheni, part of the mitzvah of eating Korban Pesach Bechlal, eating it the night after it's brought? You see, because they're also two separate things. The first Pesach is brought in a special time, which is a Chag, as the Rebbe said at great length, and we see that that's why we say Hallel when we eat the Korban Pesach in the first Pesach, because it comes in a special, so it's a separate package. Second Pesach is eaten without the fanfare of Hallel. You eat it the evening after you bring it up. By the bring up the Korban Pesach, requires Hallel, because that's the same doing as doing the first Pesach, but the eating is a different eating. You can't just put it together and say it's the same mitzvah eating Korban Pesach. Here it's an eating on the night of Yom Tov with Hallel, and it's connected with the 15th. Here it's an eating that's not really bound with the eve of the 15th of the year. It's technically just the evening after the Shechita. And therefore it can't be packaged together as one mitzvah, it's two separate mitzvahs. Now says the Rabbi, the explanation of all this in Pinimi Yisches. Yitzias Mitzrayim is from one of the main and general things that happened in the lifetime of a Jew. That's when the beginning of the birth of Am Yisrael was, the people of Israel was. That's when they went from being the servants of Pari to becoming the servants of Hashem. As the Pasuk says, for you, Bnei Yisrael, you are servants to me, my servants that I took them out of Egypt. And since this is the birth of a Jew, this is when we go from slavery to becoming Hashem's people. And since the content of Korban Pesach is about preparing and bringing to the general concept of Yitzias Mitzrayim, what led to the going out of Egypt was the Korban Pesach. That's even now the preparatory steps for going out to become Avdei Hashem. So you understand that also all the details that the Torah tells about it are not just details, but each of them is its own is its own rule, is its own generality as well. And this itself is the reason why, by the instruction of Korban Pesach, we see in the Torah so many details and small. It goes down to great details, not just like it says by other korbanos. You got the mitzvah of eating korbanos. No, here we have many minute details. How you have to prepare, how you have to eat it. Because here we have here what's underscored and emphasized is the chashivos of Korban Pesach, and we could say this is the reason why Pnimis Yonim. Remember, this is always happening again and again, right? Because this we can understand every year, every day. Because this we can understand in Pnimius why the bringing of the Korban and the eating Korban Pesach become a separate mitzvah, each on its own. Because each of the things, shechting the Korban Pesach and eating the Korban Pesach, has its own centrality and is an ikar, is a central tenet in preparing to the general theme of going out of Mitzrayim, as we can explain in Yud. Now we're into Tes. According to this, we also understand why Dafka by Korban Pesach we find that those that were Tomei came with a Taina. Lama Nigara, why should we be left out? Even though, what do you mean, why should you be left out? There's a rule, when the time passes, the Korban is bottle. Avaz Mane, bottle Korbaneh. However, by Korban Pesach it's different. If you left out, if you missed the bringing the Korban Pesach, in other words, if you miss another Korban because of technical reasons, you missed it. However, Korban Pesach, it's not just you missed your technical Korban. If you miss Korban Pesach, you're going to be missing a central theme in your Yiddishkeit, because the whole concept is that Korban Pesach achieves the transformation from being Parei servants to being at the level of Avdei Hashem. A Jew can't just let such a tremendous transformational Korban just pass by. And that's why these that were Tomei, Hashem gave them another chance to bring a Pesach Sheni. More than that, it's so central and so critical that it says that that we're dealing here with individuals. In other words, who's given the mitzvah of Korban Pesach Sheni? Individuals. That's how important it is that even when individuals are in need, Hashem created a separate opportunity at Pesach Sheni, because we know the rule is if the whole community is Pesach, is Tomei, they don't bring a Korban Pesach. They bring it on the first year, on the first Pesach, which means to tell you that the whole concept of the second chance is only when it's not the whole community, it's only when it's individuals. It's so important that even Hashem looks out for the individual, that even an individual shouldn't be lacking this opportunity for the transformation of going from bondage of Parei to becoming an Eved Hashem. And another day, makeup day, was given. That Korban Pesach is going to engage the whole Jewish people. The Kohanim, Levim, they all have to come, and a month later they have to operate the whole situation, the whole Korban. And we learn from this forever time. There's no lost situation. You can always fix, because it's such a central thing. You can't just let it. It can't just pass by. Hashem gives an opportunity. Since it's so central in Yud, now we're up to Yes Yud. According to this, we can understand with Pnimius why Pesach Sheni can only fill and only replace the Hakrava and the eating, the bringing up of the Korban and the eating, but not the saying Hallel, which you say only on the first Pesach, because only the offering up and which parts of the Korban Pesach are central and critical: the shechting, bringing up the Korban part, and the eating, but not the saying Hallel when you're eating. What's the explanation there? In the hachana, in the preparation of Yidden to become servants of Hashem, you needed to have two things. First of all, they had to shecht. What does it mean to shecht? It means that the local thing that was served was the lamb. So they had to shed from themselves, throw off from themselves the lamb. In other words, David is out of Egypt, and the shackles of the slavery of Parei. And the only way you could rid that of themselves was through Mesiras Nefesh, through dedication in a way of self-sacrifice to Hashem. I mean, taking the lamb in Egypt, that was the Avodah Zarah, in front of the eyes of the Egyptians was Mesiras Nefesh. Two, this Korban Pesach had to also be eaten by the Jews. In other words, the Mesiras Nefesh, to be a servant of Hashem, needs to become part of who the person is. When we eat, it says in Tanya that when you eat, it becomes part of your flesh. And it has to totally permeate and totally assimilate into the person in all of his inyanim. Till Mamish is eating and his Gashmi's dika things, they all have to be permeated with Mesiras Nefesh. And since the Shechita and the offering, the Korban Pesach, and the eating with all of its details are central themes, that's why there has to be a chance. That's why Hashem gave, and there has to be a way to be able to make it up. Because otherwise, Chas V'Shalom, there would be a gaping hole in the service of a Yid. Because this is the time of the year where Hashem gives the opportunity to move from being a servant to Pari to being a servant to Hashem. However, saying Hallel the time of eating the Korban Pesach, which is only... It's not connected with actually eating the Korban Pesach. It's actually connected with the night of Tezvav Nisan, because of the night of the Kedusha and all the miracles. And that's why you say the Hallel. That's not an Inyan Kololi in the preparation to become an Eved of Hashem. And that's why there Hashem didn't have to give an opportunity to be mashlim that. So that part is not replaceable. However, the Hallel that you say by the Shechita, which comes from the Shechita itself, that's an integral part of the Aveda of the Shechita. And that's why it has to be also a Chelek of the Aveda, of the Korban Pesach also, which you can fix also. And that's, in Pesach Sheni, the Shechita is also done with Hallel.